entitled Food and Beverage, Ending the Boardroom Debate. Clearly there's the folks on this call, webinar today, have experienced what I think is really a rampant issue in the entire industry. It's really one of the most highly discussed facets in the club industry, food and beverage. And it's, I'm actually going to just, if you bear with me for a minute, I'm just going to shut off that beeping sound. There we go. That should take care of that. Clearly, food and beverage is one of the most highly discussed areas of the industry, and we believe to the detriment of the industry. It's a detractor of what we feel and what we think the data shows clubs should be focused on, and it's often a red herring and really spins both club strategy and certainly boardroom time in the wrong direction. There's really an eternal struggle around this topic, and it's really that struggle of, is food and beverage an amenity or is it a profit center? And obviously there's strong opinions on either side, but we feel the data shows, and what we're going to talk about today, the data shows pretty concrete results that it really is in one direction. And we'll just we'll let the data bear that out. I won't kind of spoil that, although I think you might know where I'm going to be going. There's also, it's a way to deal with, quite often boards have, or committees have, kind of that one agenda item person, and food and beverage is their deal, and maybe it's someone who used to own a restaurant or still owns a restaurant, and of course in their view, why aren't we making 30% on food and beverage? That's what my restaurant made. So, that's the reality of what GMs and clubs face. So what we're going to talk about today is not based on our opinion, but it's based on really a reflection back to us of what the industry is and how it actually behaves. It's not what we think it should be, how we think it should operate. What club benchmarking is all about is really reflecting back to the industry how the industry performs. It's taking data from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of individual clubs, putting an analysis layer on top of it, and then giving it back to our subscribers, or in this case the broad industry, so that they can use that information not as individual data points but as real actionable intelligence, so that they can move the club in the right direction. Maybe it's getting your staff to move in the right direction. Maybe it's getting a board member of the entire board to move in the right direction. So while our overall mission is to give clubs access to great information that helps them manage with facts rather than opinion, we've kind of got a submission. And that submission really is to try to get boards and clubs to stop talking about food and beverage so much. Stop talking about it as though it's a key financial driver of the club. So, with that, our goal for today is to cover a few key topics. One is to just talk about the perception versus the reality of food and beverage. And those are two very different things, and we're going to try to bring those things together. We're going to look at some actual data and look at measuring the industry on some of these key attributes, and also understanding how do I assess my club relative to that. We're going to specifically address the age-old profit center versus an amenity debate. We're going to look at some of the key ratios that fit in food and beverage, and then of course we're going to draw up with some conclusions, and we're going to have hopefully some period of time for questions. We are going to record this webinar, so it will be archived, and you'll be able to listen to it after the fact. Other folks will be able to come in and listen to it, because we really are passionate about having clubs start to defocus off of food and beverage. It's an important social amenity of the club, but to defocus on it from a financial perspective a little bit. We're going to try to hold this to the 30-minute goal with these Fast Facts webinars. We really want to make these quick hit. You can ask questions. There's a little chat box in the GoToMeetings control box on the right, you'll see. And so you can type those questions in, and if we don't get the chance to answer those all in real time, we'll try to answer them by email. Just to kind of put the whole thing in context, I think most people know, but why are we doing this? What is club benchmarking? We are a subscription-based management tool. It really is so that clubs have accurate, reliable industry data, not so they can see what other clubs are doing, but so they can learn more about themselves. when you understand your own key metrics and ratios, it's really understanding your own club and your own club's business model better than you did before. And of course, our users use this data to drive alignment around facts as opposed to having division in the club around opinions. So with all that, a little bit of a premise, I think some of these quotes might sound familiar to some of you. I would say that every one of these quotes has been uttered just about every boardroom in the country over the last year or two. If it hasn't, you probably have a pretty good board, and you should thank the stars for that. We should make money in F&B. Hey, it's $1.5 million, $2 million food and beverage operation. How could we not make money with that much cash flow going through it? Well, we're going to talk about that. And that's one of the things you hear. We need more banquets. Banquets make money. If we just have another 5 weddings next year, another 10 parties, or whatever it is, thinking that that's gonna move the needle and turn your food and beverage model operational and have no other impact on the club, and we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. Our labor is too high. That's one of these. We live in a world of facts, and we say there are code words when you're going to hear an opinion, and code words like too high, too low, too much, too little, too fast, too slow. Those are all those are all code words that you're about to hear an opinion, or you've just heard an opinion. This is one you hear a lot, and our food costs are too high. The ultimate political football. Boards love kicking around food costs, and as we'll show, not only in the context of the club is F&B not a financial driver, but in the context of the food and beverage department, the food cost itself isn't even the key driver. Overall, boards spend too much time on F&B financials, variances. We've heard crazy things, how much the Cheez-Its and the pretzels cost on the grill room, bar in the last quarter. Should we charge the Rotary Club if they want to bring in their own deli platter? All this minutia that really has nothing to do with the overall health of the club. And hopefully we're going to give you some good tools today to help combat this a little bit. So just to put, under the guise of perception and the perception that food and beverage is a significant financial driver in clubs, well, certainly from a revenue perspective, it is a significant part of the revenue. By the way, I'm going to explain these charts. This is a chart directly out of one of the club benchmarking reports that our members run. So I've just highlighted this food and beverage slice. This on the pie on the left is my club for the club I was in, and the pie on the right is just the average of the clubs I was looking at. So, by and large, food and beverage represents about 1/3 of a club's revenue. Obviously, it's higher in some clubs and lower in other clubs, but it's a big chunk of the revenue. And in the standard business world, certainly the world that a lot of board and committee members come from, revenue is king, and of course you want to understand your top line. So there's a justification from that perspective that food and beverage is a place that we need to focus on because it's 1/3 of our revenue. And then of course if we look at there's a range, and across roughly 1,000 clubs here, this is another type of chart that is automatic for our members when they set a filter or run a report. They'll get a line chart of their comparison clubs and see exactly where they are. But obviously there's a wide range. Clubs run from under 20% of their revenue coming from food and beverage to as high as 45–50% of their revenue coming from food and beverage. So it's a big chunk either way you look at it, and so that kind of creates context for, hey, of course we should be talking about it in the boardroom for 50% of the time because it's such a huge piece of our revenue. And likewise on the expense side, same kind of thing, right? It's about 1/3 of our expenses. This club happens to be higher, but it's about 1/3 of our expenses. And so therefore, if it's 1/3 of our revenue and 1/3 or more of our expenses, of course we should be talking about it. But there's a different perspective, and the folks that have sort of been with us for a while or have followed us for a while know we have a model of the club world that we call the available cash model. It's basically a way to say it's not so much the revenue of the club that supports the club, but it's the gross profit. It's that dues revenue and the net of any other revenue-producing departments. It's your golf operations revenue from green fees, from card fees. It's that pile of cash that the club generates. Well, that's what really supports the course maintenance, your G&A, your buildings, all the things that the club has to fund. It really comes from this available cash, quote-unquote, gross profit of the club. And so the reality is, when you look at the club industry, there really are two places that the cash comes from. It's from dues, where 78% on average, the gross 78% of your gross profit comes from dues. 15% comes from golf or so if you're a golf-oriented club. But the real story is there is no slice here for food and beverage, right? Either for the club I happen to be using as an example or the overall industry. Food and beverage as an aggregate does not produce cash for clubs. And we're going to get very specific on that. And I think this slide and the next slide are really the strong arguments that GMs or board members can use with other board members to show that it's not a profit center in the industry. It's an amenity. So the places that your cash comes from clearly are a couple places, and neither one of those are food and beverage. And when we look at food and beverage, we look at it in the context of available cash, and there's a couple key messages I want you to take out of this slide. This red line represents break even. So clubs that make profit on food and beverage are over on this side of this, are above the line, and clubs that lose money on food and beverage are below the line. And this line represents the 75th percentile. So the one key message here is in the club industry, 75% of clubs lose money in food and beverage. They are below break even. About 20–25% do produce a little bit, and we like to look at the net of food and beverage relative to the available cash required to run the club, because what we see here at the median of the industry, the median club has a food and beverage loss that equates to 4% of its available cash. So 4% of the money that the club requires to fund itself represents the loss in food and beverage. Yet there's boards all over this country spending 50, 60, 70% of their boardroom time talking about food and beverage as though it's the critical financial driver to fund the club. So we beg to differ, and we said, our view is the data clearly indicates that whether a club wants it to be an amenity or a profit center in their particular club is one question. But in the industry, food and beverage is an amenity, it's not a profit center. And the fact that this industry exists with 3/4 of the clubs in it actually having to subsidize food and beverage, really bears out that view that it is an amenity, not a profit center. And the real perspective here is that, it's for most clubs, for 50% of the clubs, the subsidy in food and beverage, the subsidy to coming from available cash into food and beverage represents about, from 0% to 8% of the club's cash required to run itself. Not a massive number, it's a small number, and that's what helps put it in context. To kind of wrap some thoughts around this is you kind of want to look at it relative to not an absolute number. Club A can lose $300,000 of food and beverage and it's a disaster. Club B can lose $300,000 and it's not an issue at all. It's insignificant. What makes it a disaster or insignificant is how much of my available cash did that subsidy chew up. If it chewed up 3 or 4%, you're right down the middle of the industry. There's nothing to see here. Move along. If it did require 15% of your available cash to subsidize food and beverage, that's probably an issue because it's just it's consuming too much of your available cash and it's stealing away from the other things that you need to fund. So key messages here: 75% of clubs lose money in food and beverage. That clearly speaks to the expectations when you have a board member who says, of course we should make money in food and beverage. Well, now their perception is, well, wait a minute, 3/4 of the clubs don't. So we'd already be an anomaly if in fact we made a profit. using this view from a budgetary perspective, a lot of clubs now who are subscribers, they actually tell the GM or the food and beverage director, they map this into a hard number, but they just say, your goal is to have a loss of X, and that X equates to, pick a number, 2, 3, 4% of the club's available cash, and that tells them that they're running right down the middle of the industry, and it's a fine, reasonable place to be. There are, as we just saw, there are some clubs that do make a little bit of money on food and beverage. And you can see these clubs that they work very hard to make 4, 5, 6% of their available cash come from food and beverage. So if you think about this slice, the most successful clubs in the country, if you want to call it successful, the clubs that focus the most intensely on food and beverage, they have an available cash pie that looks exactly like this, except they have a little slice that says 4 or 5% comes from food and beverage. And that's, we're going to talk about in a minute, not sure that's the right focus for the club. Given the effort the club needs to put on that, are they really getting a reward for the effort they put against it? So a question just came in. It's a good question. How do we define available cash? We certainly don't have time today to go through it. You're going to actually receive an email, the available cash white paper. But fundamentally, it's your dues revenue plus the net of F&B, which usually subtracts, plus essentially your the net of your golf operations, so greens fees, cart fees, things like that. By and large, that's what makes it up. And any other net of your major revenue producing departments. So it's basically your dues plus the net of your revenue producing departments, and that forms essentially the gross profit of the club. So here's a case study. A club, it was a beautiful club out in California, nice big club, $10 million club, and they had an extreme focus on F&B because the club was convinced that that's where we want to be. And in fact, they made 4% of their available cash came from food and beverage. They were profitable. They made $250,000. You know what? They were holding, 300-person weddings every single weekend. And so at the end of the year, their available cash pie looked like this. Okay, great. We got this little 4% slice. What about the 96% of the available cash? And oh, by the way, the members were not happy because every weekend the club was flooded with all these non-members. Big issue, high member impact. Frankly, the facility was getting the crap kicked out of it. And so, while you think you're making $250,000, when you apply that against the shortened lifespan of rugs, tables, chairs, all those kind of things, you're really making $250,000. And frankly, all the effort of having who knows how many staff, all the people focused on more weddings, more banquets, all that could be replaced with the dues of another 25 members. So when you weigh the impact of one versus the other, you can do it. You can generate money in food and beverage if you really want to, but it's not a strategic decision. It's a very tactical decision, and I would argue that it's to the detriment of the overall membership, not to the benefit of the overall membership. So this is all about keeping things in context. We do have more to go through, and I have to be careful of time because we're going to try to keep on track. So just from another perspective, city clubs, a little bit different. You actually see about half or maybe 60% of the clubs lose money in food and beverage, as opposed to about 3/4 of the clubs with golf. So a little bit different. And then yacht clubs, about half the clubs lose money on food and beverage, and about half the clubs make a little bit of money on food and beverage. So, it does vary a little bit, and golf clubs, I think, given that the course itself is the main amenity, it's an expensive amenity. It's the focus of the club. It should be the focus of the club. You just see different, a little bit different behavior of golf clubs versus city clubs versus yacht clubs. And our members use this data because they go into a boardroom, and when they've had the one agenda board member who says, why, this is crazy, we're not making money in food and beverage. Why aren't we? And you can go in with this particular chart, it's one of the GM's favorite charts, and they say, well, wait a minute, we're just like everybody else, yeah, if you want to move us a little bit one way or the other, it's fine, but why do we need to be up here, given that we know it's such a small contributor, and we're going to really turn the club on its head to try to get that, 3 or 4% coming out of food and beverage. One of the interesting things to note, when you look at the gross margin of the clubs that really focus on food and beverage, they actually drag their margin down. For a typical club, the gross margin is right at about 60%. When you have an overabundance of revenue coming from food and beverage, obviously we've just seen that doesn't produce cash, it consumes cash. You actually pull the margin down of your club. So the clubs that say, hey, we're the banquet factory, we're going to really drive food and beverage, quite often all they do is they're spinning plates, literally, to drive revenue, but that revenue isn't producing any cash. So it's not really valuable to the overall margin of the club. One of the ratios people look at is food and beverage net as a percentage of food and beverage sales. And it does, it is a good indicator, and it does help you understand within the department how you're performing. But the reason we like the available cash reference is because that tells you the impact on the overall club. You might have a $300,000 loss in food and beverage, and it might be 10% of your food and beverage operation. But to understand the club impact, you really want to look at it for how much of the cash I need to run the club does that $300,000 represent. Okay, so one of the key indicators, by the way, the key indicator, if you do want to try to manage the result of food and beverage, it is really all about labor. At the industry median, labor is about 64% of food and beverage revenue, and it's a pretty wide cut, but it's pretty tight in the middle. 50% of clubs run between 57% and 72% for a labor ratio in food and beverage. Now, there are clubs that run as high as 100% in labor. So they've spent every penny of their food and beverage revenue, and they haven't even bought a piece of hamburger yet. And so you think, well, how do they get away with that? And so that's why context is important. That's why you don't want to try to manage your club with individual data points, and that's why we think the value of club benchmarking is you look at everything in context. Because if you're running at 100% labor revenue, but at the end of the day, your net available cash or your operational results is break even or better, that's fine. It just says that your business model supports the ability to have an extremely high food and beverage labor ratio. It might be a culture thing. We know clubs, some of the big clubs in Florida, they might have $8 million of food and beverage revenue, and they lose $7 million. But they have a massive pile of dues revenue because that's the core model of their club. So when you look at the overall club, it's fine. They're supporting themselves, they're breaking even, or even throwing off a little operational cash. And if that supports a very high labor revenue for food and beverage, no problem. Now the flip side of that is, if you're running an 80% labor revenue and you're hemorrhaging cash operationally, you have a significant loss in operations at the end of the year. Well, you might want to look at, we need to try to move that back to break even. If we're running 80%, we might want to, move ourselves down this curve. And there is a direct correlation. We see it all the time. The clubs that have, higher percentage loss in food and beverage, they tend to have higher labor ratios. The ones that actually produce a little bit of cash, they tend to have lower labor ratios. So this really is the ratio that you want to watch if you do want to try to manipulate it a little bit. But it's where culture and finances meet, I think, is in the labor zone. Food costs, it's a political football. We're not going to get into it too much here, but obviously, folks produce the charts, and there's a lot of effort, we think, put into food costs that you want to be efficient, and you want to make sure you don't have waste. But, if you've got, we've seen clubs where the new president comes in and he says, his number one agenda item is, I'm going to move food costs from, 40% to 38%. And, thinking that that's going to change the result of the club. And we kind of came in and helped them, and we ran the numbers, and we said, you realize that that's 0.3% of your available cash is going to have no meaningful impact on the club. And that's what we mean by context when we talk about context all the time. You know, clubs use this as tactical, certainly, but menu pricing, we have, it's interesting how consistent menu pricing is in the industry. And folks look at for the 6 menu items we track and the 6 beverage items, you know, they say, hey, what is our menu pricing like? And it does vary a little bit, but it's pretty darn consistent. Now, quality differs. You know, the cut of beef you get at one club is very different than the other, even though they change the same price, and that tends to be where your results might differ a little bit. Want to make sure I keep to my time here. So, and there's a lot to talk about, and I am more than happy to talk to anybody on the webinar and go into this a little bit deeper, show them a demo, go into the platform. But it's important, and we're going to have a couple questions in a minute. I'm going to bring Terry on in a second, and she's going to ask some questions. But, you know, my general conclusions, our general conclusions, you know, the data shows F&B in the industry, it's clearly an important social amenity. You want to have a vibrant you know, gathering of folks in your restaurants and grill rooms, but it's not a profit center. And the sooner this industry stops trying to treat food and beverage like a profit center, we believe that it becomes a healthier industry because they focus on the things that matter, the things that actually drive cash, dues, membership, green fees. That's what drives cash. Even the most you know, successful food and beverage clubs in the country, you know, for every $1 of revenue, they're producing maybe 5 cents of cash if they're the 90th percentile. $1 of dues revenue is $1 of cash, and that's where the focus of the board and the club should be. You know, treating F&B as a significant financial driver is misguided, we believe, and it certainly leads to inappropriate expectations and, you know, numerous wasted board hours. I think, you know, anyone that's been in the industry for a while can attest to that. If you're going to manage the numbers, know your facts, the labor ratios. Where am I? Where's the industry? How does that correlate to where my net available cash is? Connecting the dots, and we can help folks do that. You know, banquets, the margin on banquets is better than the margin a la carte, so it can help subsidize F&B, but it's not a place to try to replace dues revenue. It's not a place to you know, try to drive profit. It's simply a place we believe, you know, it's a member benefit if it's certainly member banquets and weddings you're doing. And it is a place, because of a little bit improved margin, it does help you subsidize your a la carte side a little bit. So it's good. We're not saying don't do it. We're just saying understand why you're doing it and keep it in perspective for the whole club. You know, align on the proper context, set the right expectations, you know, keep, you know, use data. I like to say that the data allows you to have certain conversations that you wouldn't have had before, and it also allows you to kill certain conversations that should never be had. And I guess where I come out on this is with the F&B data, it really helps you kind of end some of these endless conversations around food and beverage profitability. And that's important because that time that gets freed up is at least an opportunity to be put on some more strategic things. So, you know, we say anyone that really wants to tackle this in their club, you know, certainly becoming a club benchmarking subscriber is one way to do it. You're not going to tackle it with opinion, you know, a board member's opinion versus a manager's opinion. We know how that works. So you really want to have facts to try to combat that. I'm just going to quickly bring Terry on. I think she's got some questions. Terry, were there a few questions we want to try to cover?
There were. Janice Tippin asked if having an outside F&B consultant review F&B operations is a wise choice for use of available cash.
You know, there's a lot of good F&B consultants in the industry, and I think they do help drive efficiency. And I don't care if it's course maintenance or F&B or G&A or anything. You want to try to be efficient. But I guess personally, I wouldn't do that until I understood where was I really. You know, do I have a problem? And I would look at the data to assess whether I had a problem. I'd look at my ratios relative to the industry, whether it's, you know, using club benchmarking or whatever method. because you first want to identify, do I have a problem? And you want to make that identification fact-based. If you have a problem and you think you have an efficiency problem, or sure, bring in a consultant, and maybe it's rearrange the kitchen, maybe it's helping you with some other things, maybe it's where you're getting your products from. But if the data says, you know what, we're just like everybody else, we don't have a problem, this is just what the industry is, then I'm not sure what you'd really accomplish. I mean, certainly, a consultant is happy to come in and help you out, but I guess that would be my view is before you do it, use the facts to say, do we really have a problem or not?
So, Russ, we have one more question, and that's, can you unmute Tommy Lee? He asked, I think it was the F&B labor number, whether the 64% was gross or net.
That I assume it's gross or net, does he mean? So that's including its salary and wages, its payroll taxes and benefits. We include distributed gratuities in part of that. So that is a grossed up number at 64%. And I don't see him, I don't see his audio here that I can turn him on. So I hope, Tommy, if I didn't answer your question, just shoot me an email or give me a call.
Okay. Chuck Fox asks, how do you break out HOA club data? And I had another question earlier about whether we have HOA club data.
We do have HOA club data. In fact, one of the things we do each year with Master Club Advisors is we do we handle data for all their symposiums. So one of their symposiums is the Gated Club Symposium. I think it's coming up in October, and it really is all about HOAs. And so, yeah, we have quite a bit of HOA data. And typically for HOAs is most HOAs, they do segregate their club financials from I'll call it the HOA financials. And so we treat, we prefer that method as well. So when we're looking at an HOA, the club side of an HOA, it really looks like any other club, even non-HOA clubs, because typically that data is segregated. So, and it doesn't, off the top of my head, I don't know, I can't say exactly that the data is any different for an HOA. My gut says how much I've looked at. I don't think the data is any different, but certainly we have lots of HOA data as well.
I have one more question, which is, do you have data for average food cost?
Absolutely. In fact, the one chart let me go back, the one chart we looked at this is all real data that we're using here. So for the industry, I should know this off the top of my head, but for the industry, food cost is 42% and beverage cost is 33%.
But clarify, that's median, not average.
That's median, exactly. So, and this is a curve of probably 1,000 clubs. And so, you can see the 50% of the clubs fit between 38% and 45%. And, this is really where the context comes in, because it's if you think about this as a hierarchy, not only is food and beverage, really hammering on food and beverage financials, typically is not really a strategic discussion for clubs. Once you get into F&B, labor is actually a greater driver on the results of F&B than food cost is. So, if you're, from my perspective, if you're anywhere in this range, this 50% of clubs range, honestly, there's nothing to see here. If you're up here in the top, maybe, but it may just be that the culture of your club is you're serving the best cut of beef you can get, and they're paying, $26 for that fillet because it's one of the big clubs in Florida, and the culture is we lose a ton of money on F&B, but we have $30 million of dues revenue, and that's the way the members like it. And as long as the club business model is whole at the end of the year, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. So that's the problem with measuring to individual data points versus looking at the whole club. Any other questions, Terry?
I'm not seeing any other questions. Just very quickly, can you explain why you're showing her a median number as opposed to an average?
Oh, yeah, we don't like averages. Averages, especially if you get to smaller data sets, maybe if you filtered clubs down, or maybe you're only looking at 20 clubs, an average can swing, wildly based on one data point. Whereas when you have a median, which is, the middle club, if you've got 100 clubs, the median value is that middle club. It's basically the 50th or 51st club. It's that value. So you don't get those wild swings because even if you have a club on the end, which is, a 10x number, it doesn't swing the average. So from a statistical perspective, using medians and percentiles is far better than using averages. Averages, I think the industry has, up till recently done a pretty poor job of, just showing, the average of something. Well, that doesn't mean anything. If your dues is, I don't know, $6,000 and you're looking at a club set and the average is $8,000, well, what does that tell you? That doesn't tell you anything. You don't know how much dues they need. How much dues revenue do they need? What are all the other facets of the club? So averages are dangerous things. We much prefer percentile.
Russ, I have one more question, which is Debbie Kane asking, how do you manage labor percentage and not have service suffer?
It's a code, like I said, that labor percentage is let me go back to that chart actually, is the meeting of, I would call it, finances and culture. And so managing it doesn't mean reducing it. It means that it's at the proper level for the affordability of your club. So what's proper, one club, it may be completely proper to have an 85% labor ratio because the available cash generation of that club is such that can afford to have an 85% labor ratio, and that's what that membership wants. For other clubs that, maybe are smaller clubs, it might be proper for them to have a 60% labor ratio or a 55% labor ratio because that's where the affordability of that club is. So, it comes down to, labor impacts I don't have it here. Labor impacts the net result of food and beverage. The net result of food and beverage has a relative impact on how much cash is it sucking out of your club that your club needs to pay for all the other things it needs to pay for. And, we saw that at the industry median, let me get back to that, it's 4%, right? So that F&B loss, which labor is a part of, equates to 4% of a club's available cash. Now, if your F&B loss is 15% of your available cash, and you're losing money operationally, and your F&B labor was 80%, it's all about connecting the dots and saying, okay, I probably can't afford to have an 80% labor ratio because I'm burning cash. I probably need to work that down a little bit. And so that's the whole idea here is instead of, if you want to change a particular result in a club, instead of just shotgunning and trying things, it's understanding the cause and effect. When you see the curves, and we're only looking at a few here, and we help clubs, of course, but when you see that the relationship between the labor ratio and the net food and beverage result, you start to understand, all right, it's intuitive, but now you have numbers. If I slide one way on the curve, if I slide my labor ratio, I don't want to jump around here too much, but if I slide my labor ratio down, I'm going to move up the curve on that net F&B relative to available cash, right? My F&B consumption of cash is going to be smaller because I've reduced my cost. So it's about that balance point, right? And so our view here is stop, clubs should stop trying and talking about trying to shift that balance point to try to make money in F&B, to try to be a profit center. Except that we're not restaurants, we're clubs. We don't have the term, I can go into the whole dissertation around, why a club model is different, but, the data shows that clubs don't, they don't make money in F&B. And so instead of trying to be an anomaly club and turning the club on its ear, be a typical club. There's nothing wrong with having typical food and beverage impact on the finances of the club. There's nothing wrong with being at the median and saying, we consume 4% of our available cash, which is right down the middle of the industry. So, that's kind of our view is use this to set expectations and behave that way and don't use the data to, A, stop talking so much about food and beverage in the boardroom, and B, set expectations more appropriately such that in the following year, you don't have to keep visiting, the same variances and all those issues over and over again.
Russ, Pauline asked if payroll taxes are included in labor cost.
It is. That labor ratio is fully loaded. So it's your salary and wages, it's your payroll taxes and benefits, and it's including gratuities that get that get moved in. And I didn't even get into it. I mean, I was gonna, if we had time, I was going to, take a look at some of the other indicators in the food and beverage report that our members run. But it shows you your food and beverage revenues, your nets. You can even get into cover count, labor ratios, and revenue per cover, and labor cost per cover, and labor cost per FTE, and this is the kind of data that our members use to bring into the board, such that they can start bringing in facts. And so when you hear the too high, the too low, the too much, the too little, you can put the chart on the table and diplomatically, of course, say, well, actually we're not too high. We're actually a little bit low, or we're right at the median. And it changes the discussion. We've seen it. I have physically seen the dynamics in the room change when you put the facts on the table, and that one, especially that one agenda item person, they kind of sit back and frankly, you took the air out of the argument for them. And in this case, it's a good thing because it's an argument that shouldn't be had in the first place. And the way then you also bring different data in is you say, by the way, here's what really does matter. Here's what we should be talking about. The overall labor ratio for the club, critical to understand where are we. Obviously, dues, revenue, and all those kind of things that we don't have time to talk about. So.
I just put my email address on the screen if anybody has a question. I just saw one more. What about opening different venues at the same time? I don't know if we want to start taking some of these questions offline, or if people are content to stay with us.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously I want to try to let people go, but obviously if you have multiple venues, we've seen clubs with multiple venues, one kitchen. I mean, depending on how far they have to go. Yeah, there's typically in one of the filters we have in the database that members use, clubs that have multiple venues, you can literally filter and say, I want to look at my food and beverage operation. I want to look at clubs with 2 to 4 million in F&B revenue with more than one venue or with 2 venues, and you can start to see, okay, you know what, our labor ratios look just like everybody else's labor ratios with our characteristics. So it's about letting the user define the comparison they want to make, and giving them the ammunition so that when they're trying to have the discussion, it's not going around the table and get everybody giving their opinion and deciding whose opinion you're going to use that night. So, but yeah, we're happy to take any other questions that come in offline. Certainly email us. We're happy to help. This stuff works. This stuff is important. And it makes a difference for managers, for clubs, for board members. We've seen this stuff work. So, I would say if you haven't been engaged at all, try to get engaged. And, there's a lot of managers we work with that have been in the industry for 30 years, and they say to us, where the hell were you guys 30 years ago? So, which is nice. It's a nice thing to hear. But anyway, I think we're going to let it go with that. We do have another webinar coming up next month. You'll receive an email on that, so keep your eyes open, and we will hopefully see you all at future webinars. Thank you.